What is up, Who Dat Nation? Ross Jackson here. Day one of the NFL Draft is finally in the books, and these are the Canal Street Chronicles. So with the Saints having made their first round selection, they get on the board at 24. Jordan Love is still on the board. Patrick Queen, linebacker out of LSU, is there. Jeff Gladney, TCU corner, is there. And so the Saints, with all of those options on the board, select offensive lineman Cesar Ruiz out of Michigan. Now, I'm being a little dramatic here. I personally do like the pick. Is it the pick that I would have made? No, most certainly not. I would have gone Patrick Queen, linebacker out of LSU, all day. But that's why I don't make the big bucks and those other guys do. But certainly with those guys left on the board, it was a little bit of a disappointment for Saints fans to see Cesar Ruiz, who a lot of Saints fans may not have heard of because he played mostly at offensive center, offensive guard for the most part. So not really a position that a lot of, at least, let me say, maybe casual college fans, right, that are paying attention to the NFL draft, because now these are players that are coming into the NFL, really get to know. You don't get to know a lot of prospects on the interior offensive line unless you're really digging deep. So let's talk a little bit about Cesar Ruiz, his fit, and why the Saints ended up selecting him instead of the plethora of other skill position playmakers that were on the board. So at 6'3", 306 pounds, he played 26 games at center for Michigan, as well as 5 games at right guard. Those 5 games came all in his freshman year, the last 5 games of his freshman season. Those are the only games that he played at right guard. After that, 26 straight at center. That's 13 in each season. Never missed a game during the time when he finally got his opportunity to start for those final 5 games of his freshman year. So he started all those games in a row. He's super smart, high football IQ, amazing personality that's definitely going to fit in with the culture of the Saints locker room. And the Saints complimented Sean Payton in particular on 3 different things when it came to making the selection of Cesar Ruiz. First of all, FBI, you've heard me talk about it already, football intelligence. They love the way that he breaks down blitzes, that he diagnoses blitzes, that he communicates with his offensive line to get them set. Does a very, very good job at that. He was complimented coming out of Michigan for his ability to identify the mic pretty quickly, IDing where those blitzes are coming from. So they really, really like what he's already able to do and what he knows about the game at only 20 years old at that. He'll be 21 by the time that the season starts, but he's only 20 years old right now and has already shown a very advanced understanding and really smart approach to the game. And the Saints, of course, love that, particularly with the potentially truncated offseason activities that are coming up here, as they're not planning to really hold rookie minis. They're just hoping that everybody shows up healthy and in good shape in July to get started with training camp. The other thing they complimented him on was that he's the one of the prospects that they just simply had the most information on. And again, this all comes down to the specifics of this pre-draft process. With the coronavirus and the COVID-19 pandemic, facilities were closed. There were no in-person visits, no top 30 visits to the facilities, nothing like that. So this was simply a guy that they knew more about, and so they went with the safe choice, being informed by that. And then the other thing was that Sean Payton simply called him one of the better offensive linemen, interior offensive linemen, that he has seen in a while. And that is some high praise coming from a coach like Sean Payton, who has done a very good job in New Orleans, really cultivating offensive line talent. Now, in the Saints offense, it seems like he's going to be playing center as opposed to right guard, but then that brings up a lot of other questions in terms of what does that mean for Eric McCoy? What does that then mean for Larry Warford? And also, what does that even mean for Nick Easton? So for Eric McCoy, why would you end up drafting somebody to play the position that the player that you just selected in the second round last year, your top selection last year, ended up playing really, really well at in his rookie season in 2019? Well, it really all comes down to the guy to the right of him on the offensive line, Larry Warford. We've been saying for months, and we've been hearing it for months, pretty much since February, since the Combine, that the Saints were not necessarily pleased with what they were seeing in Larry Warford. And a lot of people respond to that and say, well, if you're not pleased with what you're seeing in Larry Warford, how the hell could you give Andrus Peat all the money that you gave him and a big old contract extension to go along with that. And the simple fact of the matter is that Andrus Peat plays more than one position. He's more than just a guard. He's tackle depth. He can be your tackle depending on how quickly or if at all Tron Armstead gets injured and misses time. He's somebody that bounces out there. So that positional versatility, that flexibility is definitely something that's going to end up sort of always putting him up ahead of a guy like Larry Warford that plays right guard, and that's basically it. So with only playing that one position, if you're not putting up the type of production that the Saints want to see from you, you don't really have any type of a redeeming characteristic like Andrus Peat does, in that he can also play on the outside. So what does that mean for Erik McCoy, who plays center? That means that Erik McCoy could be shifted over to guard, which is something we've heard a lot over the last couple of months, at the same time that we started hearing about the Saints being displeased with Larry Warford's drop-off and being concerned about his level of play. We've heard about the potential of moving Erik McCoy to right guard. They're apparently not married to him at the center position. They like him there, and he performed very well there in his rookie year, but that's not the end-all be-all for him. So if he moved to right guard, then you end up having this open hole at center where Cesar Ruiz plugs in immediately. So we'll see how quickly all of that happens. There's a lot to watch here in terms of the ripple effect of a Cesar Ruiz pick, because if, let's say, Larry Warford gets traded, for instance, that frees up $8.5 million of salary cap for the Saints to continue to play around with over the course of free agency and potentially in the trade market throughout the rest of this offseason, even after the draft. So if they should want to maybe address a position that they could have addressed in the first round, maybe like, I don't know, linebacker or something, and they aren't able to do it through the rest of the draft comfortably, they could look to other free agents, which is not really a good sort of group of linebacker free agents at this point, but they could look to the trade market after that. And then if they decided to just flat out cut Larry Warford, they could save some money there too. I don't see either of those being what happens with Larry Warford, particularly at this stage in the game. I think they'll give him the opportunity to compete in camp and win. That's part of what Sean Payton said when he talked about him, is that now Larry Warford has to compete. This is how you make your team better. And that's true. There's truth to that. You bring young guys into the building to push those veterans to continue to get better. Larry Warford's in the last year of his deal. He either needs to get better in order to try to get an extension with the Saints, which seems highly unlikely, or he's still got to try to get better to go out there and show another team that he deserves a contract. So there's a lot still riding on this for Larry Warford. For Erik McCoy, simply could just mean a move to right guard, and then you get a super smart, hyper aware player like Cesar Ruiz to plug in and be your center, so that you have somebody that can diagnose blitzes, that can ID the mic, that can do all of that and really sort of spearhead the offensive line after Drew Brees is gone. Because last year and this year, Erik McCoy is going to have the help of Drew Brees. But after that, if you want the smart player there, not that Erik McCoy is unsmart, but if you want the smarter player there and the guy that has shown you everything that he's shown you so far in terms of that FBI, that football intelligence, that football IQ, Cesar Ruiz is your guy at the center position for whoever the future signal caller and future quarterback may be from that point forward once Drew Brees hangs it up. Now, as for Nick Easton, you have to wonder, the Saints re-signed Cam Tom. They already have Will Clapp in the building. They essentially have their two starters, let's say for right now, Andrus Peat and Larry Warford. You've got Erik McCoy that can play center as well as either one of those guard spots. And you've got Cesar Ruiz now who can play either one of those guard spots. So you've got 6 different players already involved in the offensive line. What does that mean for Nick Easton? Well, probably doesn't spell very good news for Nick Easton, who's going to have a lot of competition at a bottleneck position in the interior offensive line, because if the Saints were to cut him, they'd save $4.3 million right now. And if they designate him as a post-June 1 cut, they save $5.3 million. So yet another cap-saving move on the docket here, with Cesar Ruiz now being in the building. Now, I mentioned earlier that linebacker Patrick Queen out of LSU, quarterback Jordan Love out of Utah State, even cornerback Christian Fulton out of LSU was still on the board, and one of my personal favorites, cornerback Jeff Gladney out of TCU. All those guys were still on the board when the Saints selected Cesar Ruiz, and that's part of what the pushback, particularly from the fan base, has been, because the Saints go in and they make another safe pick and they make a selection that is a very good selection. It is a smart selection, don't get me wrong, but it's just simply not the big, flashy, sexy signing or big, flashy, sexy draft pick that many of us expected. Justin Jefferson almost made it all the way down to them. I think he made it to 22 to the Vikings. And then you had a couple of other players that were really within reaching distance. CeeDee Lamb dropped all the way down to 18. Kind of hard to expect that the Saints would actually trade up that far, that many spots to get him. But I mean, that's a talent right there that you could make a move for. But the Saints felt really resolved to just sit back, let the draft play out in front of them. They said that the draft played out exactly the way that they wanted, and this is what they wanted to be able to walk away with. At pick number 24, reportedly, they were also interested in AJ Terrell, who went much earlier, personally, than he probably should have, and as well as Javon Kinlaw, who ended up going at 14 to the San Francisco 49ers. So those players were well off the board by the time that the Saints rolled around to 24, and they went much earlier than the Saints would have been willing to trade forward to grab them. So they end up with who seemed to be one of their top guys, if not their absolute top guy, in Cesar Ruiz, the offensive lineman out of Michigan. So now let's take a look at what some of the Saints' remaining needs look like with the rest of this draft. Still more than 220 picks left in this draft. So a lot of space for the Saints to continue to evaluate and continue to address other positions of need. The top one, in my opinion, of course, and I think many of you would agree, being linebacker, because the Saints did not address that, but still some good linebackers on the board going into day 2. Troy Dye, Logan Wilson, Akeem Davis Gaither. You could probably throw Willie Gay in there as well, even though he's got some baggage. The next up for me would be wide receiver. Still some very good wide receivers in this draft. I'm a personal fan of Van Jefferson out of Florida. The Saints did not address wide receiver in the first round, which doesn't really surprise me. This is probably the deepest wide receiver class that we've ever seen, and I think next year's is even deeper. And so with that being the case, the Saints in no hurry to address the wide receiver position, and they brought in Emanuel Sanders, who by all means doesn't necessarily negate the need at the position, but while it certainly alleviates the need, it doesn't completely make it to where they won't address it. But it's also not as huge a need as it was before Emanuel Sanders, who will be wearing number 17, shout out Emmanuel Butler for being a nice dude, ended up getting into the building. So that's pretty good news for the Saints, but I do expect to see them address wide receiver at some point in this draft. And then next for me, in terms of the third, maybe top 3 here to round out the top 3 needs, would be cornerback. The Saints have drafted a defensive back in every single draft of the Sean Payton era, and we know that when the Saints go offense with their first selection, wherever that may be, the next selection they'll go defense. If they go defense with the first selection, the next selection they'll go offense. So in terms of rotation here and need, linebacker, which Sean Payton himself even acknowledged was a need, and that will probably, in terms of those top linebackers that I named earlier, those guys could fly off the board pretty quickly, but the Saints already looking to mobilize if the value makes sense, and if there's a chance for them to move up, looks like they will take it. So be interesting to see if they go after a linebacker, but in the last 10 drafts, if they go offense first, they go defense second. If they go defense first, they go offense second. So this is definitely a tendency for the Saints, and a big time trend for them as well. So cornerback is the other one that I would look for. Again, they went offense, maybe they go defense next. There's still some very good corners here on the board. L'Jarius Sneed out of Louisiana, somebody they could wait around to grab a little bit later, somebody that I really, really like. But there's still guys like Christian Fulton on the board as well that are more in terms of that, or more involved in that top corner category. So be some interesting potential there for the Saints in day 2, or if they decide to wait until day 3. And then just to mention them, a couple of dark horse positions for me, running back and tight end. All right, before we wrap up here, we'll take a quick look around the NFC South. The Falcons making probably my favorite selection of the day, going with AJ Terrell, the cornerback out of Clemson. Now, AJ Terrell has gotten burnt in the Superdome before. Now he gets the opportunity to get burnt at least once a year in the Superdome, now sticking with the Falcons, and then again in the Mercedes-Benz Stadium as well in Atlanta. He's going to have a tough matchup with these Saints wide receivers, whether he be on Emmanuel Butler or Michael Thomas. But the Falcons wanted a corner. They really did. They were trying to trade up to get into the early parts of round 1. There was some talk about them trying to get as far as the 3rd pick so that they could grab Jeff Okudah, which was highly unlikely. But they were trying to get into the top 10 to get a hold of CJ Henderson. They weren't able to do that. CJ Henderson stays home in Florida, goes to the Jacksonville Jaguars, and Atlanta grabs AJ Terrell. So I'm happy with that selection because they could have ended up with a guy like Jeff Gladney. They could have ended up with a guy like Christian Fulton. And instead, AJ Terrell comes off the board to them. Well, chef's kiss. I'm happy with it. The Panthers at pick 7, making probably one of the biggest faux pas that you'll see in this NFL draft, passing on Isaiah Simmons, who was just sitting right there. They lost Luke Kuechly. They were ready to go from Luke Kuechly to Isaiah Simmons. They were primed. Everything was right there. And then they went with the nose tackle, Derek Brown. Now, don't get me wrong. Derek Brown's a fantastic player. He was part of a very, very good defensive line unit at Auburn and was outstanding. But is he the big-time playmaker that can play anywhere you want on your back seven like Isaiah Simmons was? Absolutely not. And then the Saints immediately counteract that by grabbing their starting center for the future in Cesar Ruiz. So that'll be a fun matchup to watch over the years, but I definitely think that the Panthers went a route that, let me just say that they went the route that I would have appreciated that they went, which was by passing up Isaiah Simmons, allowing him to go to Arizona to the Cardinals and taking instead the nose tackle. And then finally, the Bucs actually traded up one spot. You might ask, why would they trade up one spot? Tristan Wirfs was still on the board at 13. They were set to select at 14. They ended up trading up one spot, probably because they heard that another team was trying to trade up to 13 to grab Tristan Wirfs. They wanted him bad. So they bring Tristan Wirfs to Tampa Bay. So they get their starting tackle, their new starting tackle, who's fantastically, incredibly athletic, but is going to have a lot of trouble with looking Cam Jordan in the face every time that he meets the New Orleans Saints. But no surprise there that they get their guy in Tom Brady and then immediately address that offensive line where they need a lot of help. But now they need to keep doing some work on that offensive line and need to do more work on that secondary as well, because that Tampa Bay secondary is not ready to hold up against the wide receivers in the NFC South. All right, y'all. Thank you very much for joining me today. Be back with you with another one of these tomorrow and all through the draft, and as well as many, many other times moving forward. Thank you very much for tuning in. Make sure you check out the Canal Street Chronicles website, and make sure that you stay here and keep it locked with the Canal Street Chronicles.